Hi, everybody. I want to talk with you about The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It's one of my favorite books in the whole world, and I'm hoping that you enjoy reading it as much as I did. We'll be discussing it over the next couple of weeks. I want to give you a little bit of background first, though. It was published in 2016, so it's a pretty new novel, but it's set in the time period that we've been reading about so far. Um, it won a few big awards. The Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Award are two of the biggest awards an American novel can win. And it also was a hit with general audiences as well, winning the Goodreads Choice Award for Best Historical Fiction. I want to talk about the literary influences on this novel. The reason I wanted you to read it now instead of at the end of the semester when we get to other contemporary fiction is so that you're thinking about the context of slave narratives. In his acknowledgments, Whitehead directly acknowledges both Jacobs and Douglas. So I want you to think about the similarities and the differences between Whitehead's fiction and the nonfiction narratives of those writers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the genre of fugitive slave ads. These were actual ads that slave owners would publish in newspapers when enslaved people would run away from them. What you're seeing on this slide is the actual the actual advertisement for Harriet Jacobs, placed by Dr. James Norcom, who you know better as Dr. Flint. So you can see here that this offers an award. It gives a physical description of Harriet Jacobs, describes how she speaks, how she carries herself, what kinds of clothes she might be wearing, what skills she might have, and so on. This is one of the pieces of evidence that Jean Yellen used to authenticate the slave narrative that Jacobs had written. A few years ago in an interview, Whitehead talked about how he wanted to go find the actual historical documents and went to the University of North Carolina's digitized collection of these advertisements. 4 of the advertisements that you will see in the novel in between sections are real, the ones that he uncovered in his research. He writes the last one especially for Cora. And so when we get to that at the very end later next week, we can talk about that. I also want to talk about the contemporary literary context for this novel. The contemporary period is generally the second half of the 1900s up through the present, and we'll talk about this more in the last weeks of the semester. What we see a lot in the 20th century in general is a lot of experimentation, both with form and subject matter, and we really see that kicked up a notch in a lot of contemporary fiction. Experimenting with the form of telling stories, in this case, unusual devices like those runaway ads that we talked about, and also alinear plots that jump around in the storyline, that move back and forth. You're used to this now in TV and film, right? You might start with a scene and you don't really know what's going on, and then the TV episode or movie moves backwards in time and gets us caught up. So Whitehead is going to do that quite a bit in The Underground Railroad. You won't always know what's going on because he's going to give us a taste of it, and then he's going to move backward and fill in the puzzle pieces. So let's look at the very first sentence of the novel. The first time Caesar approached Cora about running north, she said no. So that gives us a lot of information, right? That somebody named Caesar is going to ask Cora multiple times to run away, and she says no the first time. And then in the rest of the first chapter, we're going to move backwards 2 generations in time to Cora's grandmother. And then we'll come back to that moment when Caesar approaches Cora. Something else to be aware of is the experimentation with subject matter, a wider array of subjects that are deemed worthy of literary exploration. We'll talk more about that later, but what I really wanted to talk about today is magical realism. Magical realism is the presence of magical or supernatural elements in an otherwise realistic context. So, Harry Potter is not magical realism because the whole world is fantasy, right? The whole world is filled with wizards. In this novel, and also in Song of Solomon, when we get to it later, Pay attention to elements of magical realism and the Underground Railroad itself and how it operates. Um, you know what the Underground Railroad was historically, right? If you need to do a quick search, read the Wikipedia article just to refresh your memory, go right ahead and do that. Pay attention to how Whitehead takes liberties with that and employs magical realism here and in other cases. He wrote, I'm sorry you can't see this entire quotation. He said in an interview, one that I posted for you on D2L, I'm not going to stick to the facts, but I'll stick to the truth. So think about where in the narrative he is sort of toying around with facts, things that appear in the context of this novel that aren't really historically accurate, in order to get at the larger truth of what slavery was like. Okay, so when you're reading, I mentioned these things in the reading guide as well, make sure to pace yourself. Instead of trying to put the whole first half of the novel off until Thursday, try to read it slowly over the course of this week and use the reading guide that I've posted for you. I hope those questions help you to focus your reading and think about some of the broader, more important themes in the novel. It's definitely okay to ask questions. I've set up a discussion thread for you to ask questions about the novel. Remember, as I mentioned, sometimes you won't know what's going on. You're not supposed to know what's going on. So try to be okay with a little uncertainty. There might be questions that you ask that I might say, well, I'm not going to answer that yet. You'll have to wait for the answer. But there might be other places where you're confused. You can ask a question in our discussions, and anybody can answer that question who wants to, not just me. So feel free to answer your classmates' questions as well. That's an ungraded forum, the Q&A forum on this novel. And you'll have your regular discussion post assignment this week too. I also just want to remind you, since this is a literature class, to savor the beauty of the literature, savor the language. Whitehead is an incredibly gifted writer. So pay attention to how beautifully he tells this story, and sometimes how sometimes the story will be hard to read because he's writing about the experience of enslaved people and people who run away from slavery. He's writing about white supremacists. He's writing about some really difficult subjects. So it's not always going to be fun to read, but there are passages that are just beautifully written, and it's an incredibly well-crafted novel. So try to enjoy the artistry of it. I hope you enjoy the reading process. I'm looking forward to your observations. I'll see you in our discussions.